In the year 1947, state of California, to the world, the city of Los Angeles was a beacon. It was the land of golden sunshine, the birthplace of dreams, and the glittering center of cinematic industry, fame, and popular culture. But beneath the veneer of post-World War II prosperity and the intoxicating allure of Hollywood, there existed another side, a city of sin, hard-boiled noir, and evil buried deep in the scrub brush of the urban fringe. On the morning of January 15, 1947, that fragile illusion of post-war safety was shattered. It began as a mundane Tuesday in the Lemert Park neighborhood. Betty Bersinger was walking with her 3-year-old daughter along the sidewalk of South Norton Avenue. As they passed a vacant, weed-choked lot between 39th and 40th Streets, Betty noticed something laying in the grass. At first glance, she thought it was a discarded store mannequin, a common sight in the refuse of the city. It was pale, perfectly positioned, and eerily still, but as she moved closer, a terrifying reality set in. It wasn't plastic, it wasn't a prop, it was a woman. A horrifying scene that greeted the police, the press, and eventually the public was something out of a fever dream, a nightmare. The body had been drained of blood, scrubbed clean, and posed with deliberate, macabre precision. Her mouth had been carved into a horrific, permanent grin. For the people of 1947, it was an assault on the conscience of Californians. It was a crime so brutal, so methodical, and so deeply haunting that it immediately transcended the status of simple homicide. It became a spectacle, a dark, permanent stain on the bright reputation of Los Angeles. Newspapers across the country scrambled to print the details, desperate to satisfy a public suddenly obsessed with the murder. They needed a name for the victim, and in their haste to capitalize on the tragedy, they manufactured a legend. They dubbed her the Black Dahlia. But long before she was a headline, a mystery, or a myth, she was a young lady who had come to the city looking for a future, only to find an end that would remain unsolved for nearly 8 decades and more. In this opportunity, I will research the police files and peel back the layers of the story to understand the real Elizabeth Short, the chaotic investigation that followed, and why, nearly 80 years later, this remains the most famous and the most enduring unsolved case in American history. Before the newspapers branded her the Black Dahlia, a moniker likely spawned from a sensationalist mix of her penchant for sheer black clothing and the popular 1946 murder mystery film The Blue Dahlia. Before her horrible end, Elizabeth Short was simply a person with a story that was, in many ways, emblematic of her era. Born in Boston in 1924, Elizabeth's life was defined by the restlessness of the post-Depression and war-torn years. She was the third of 5 daughters raised in a household touched by the Great Depression, a period that saw her father vanish, leaving behind his car on a bridge and a note that suggested he had taken his own life. This early trauma cast a long shadow, but it also instilled in Elizabeth a sense of independence and a drive to seek a life beyond the limitations of her upbringing. That note was a fraud. As she entered young adulthood, she became part of the Great American Migration. She moved between the East Coast, the Midwest, and eventually the pool of Southern California. Elizabeth was a drifter, not in a criminal sense, but in the spirit of the time. She was a quintessential Hollywood hopeful. She possessed a striking appearance, often remembered for her dark, flowing hair and expressive, sometimes melancholic eyes, and she navigated the social circuits of Los Angeles, hoping to find a place where she belonged. However, the life of Elizabeth in Los Angeles was far removed from the glitz of the silver screen. She was not the femme fatale the press will later portray. She was, by all accounts, a woman struggling to find stability. She moved frequently, staying in temporary accommodations, working odd jobs, and attempting to form connections in a city that was notoriously difficult for a young, solitary woman to navigate. The tragedy of Elizabeth Short is intensified by what we don't know. We know the details of her final days, her acquaintances, her interactions with men like Robert Red Manley, who was the last person to confirm seeing her alive. We know she was a woman who could be charming, elusive, and deeply lonely, and that the week leading up to her death remains a void. It is a period of silence that scars the historical record. A missing chapter that has allowed decades of speculation to flourish. To understand the Black Dahlia, we must strip away the sensationalism. She was not a character in a noir novel. She was a daughter, a friend navigating the complexities of post-war independence. By humanizing her, we make the senselessness of her death even more profound. She wasn't looking for a horrific death. She was looking for a start. If the discovery of Elizabeth Short's body was the spark that ignited the public's terror, the crime scene and the subsequent autopsy was the fuel that ensured it will never be extinguished. When the detectives from Los Angeles Police Department and the Sheriff's Office arrived on South Norton Avenue, they were met with a scene that defied conventional understanding. The body was found in a vacant lot, positioned with a disturbing sense of staging. It was bifurcated, severed completely at the waist. But there was a detail that shook even the most seasoned investigators to their core. The body had been surgically drained of all blood. The lack of blood at the location where she was discovered was the first major revelation. It was immediately clear that this lot was not the crime scene. It was the display site. Whoever had done this had access to a controlled environment, likely indoors, where he or they had the time, the privacy, and the medical or technical proficiency to execute such a clean, precise act of mutilation. The autopsy conducted by the Los Angeles County Coroner revealed the horrific extent of the perpetrator's handiwork. Beyond the bisection, Elizabeth had been subjected to extensive torture. There were ligature marks on her wrists and ankles, indicating she had been bound for a prolonged period. This was observed by Dr. Frederick Newbar. She suffered from deep lacerations to her thighs and breasts, and most infamously, the Glasgow smile, a permanent, grotesque incision that extended from the corners of her mouth toward her ears. The medical examiner's report noted that the level of surgical precision was extraordinary. This was not a crime of blind passion committed in a back alley. It was planned and delivered, cold and anatomically precise. This detail sent the LAPD and the FBI into a frenzy. They began investigating the premise that they were hunting a man with medical training, a surgeon, a butcher, or perhaps a medical student with access to anatomy labs. The investigation expanded rapidly to ensure every hospital, clinic, and medical school in the Southern California area. The primary investigator assigned to the case of Elizabeth Short was Detective John P. St. John, often remembered by his nickname Jigsaw John. Along with other forces, they cross-referenced thousands of records, looking for anyone with the skill set to commit such gruesome act. They were searching for a ghost, someone who could operate with such clinical detachment. As the details of the autopsy leaked to the press, the public's imagination began to run wild. The terrific nature of the injuries was dissected in every newspaper across the country. It became a morbid obsession, a story that people read while eating their breakfast. A story that was whispered in the corridors of power and the back rooms of the city. The autopsy wasn't just a medical document anymore. It was the central piece of the puzzle that the police were fundamentally unequipped to solve. They had the body, they had the cause of death, but they had absolutely no context for why. They were looking for a motive that matched the severity of the crime, and in the absence of one, they began to spiral into the depths of a city that was, in 1947, very good at keeping its darkest secrets. The murder of Elizabeth Short was not just a police case, it was a media phenomenon. The year 1947 was the golden age of the penny press, where newspapers competed in a ruthless war for circulation. When the story of the Black Dahlia broke, the editors of the Los Angeles newspapers smelled blood in the water, and they weren't just reporting the story, they were exploiting it. The Los Angeles Examiner is perhaps the most notorious in this regard, in a move that still shocks historians. Reporters managed to locate Elizabeth's mother, Phoebe Short, in Massachusetts. They didn't tell her that her daughter had been found dead. Instead, they spun a calculated lie. They told her that Elizabeth had won a beauty contest and that they needed personal information, background, and photographs to complete the story. When Phoebe finally learned the horrific truth via the newspaper, not the police, she was devastated. Her trust in the authorities and the media destroyed instantly. This predatory behavior created a toxic feedback loop. Every headline, every rumor published in the papers put immense pressure on the LAPD. Chief Clemens Horrigan and his team found themselves chasing ghosts fueled by public speculation. They received thousands of tips, hundreds of false confessions, and countless leads that went absolutely nowhere. The investigation was a logistical nightmare. Because the crime was so high profile, the police were forced to vet over 192 suspects. Men from all walks of life, physicians, salesmen, ex-convicts, and complete strangers were dragged into interrogation rooms. Some people confessed just for notoriety, desperate for a moment of fame in the shadow of such disgusting tragedy. Yet, amidst this chaos, there was one singular shining occasion of investigative efficiency. In a world before digital databases, the FBI had to rely on a manual system of fingerprints. By feeding Elizabeth's prints into the system, they identified her in just 56 minutes. This was the triumph of technology and organization, but it was perhaps the only clean win the authorities will ever have in this case. The police were being manipulated by the press, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of leads and hamstrung by the lack of a crime scene that meant they had no DNA, no witnesses, and no weapon. They were attempting to solve a crime with a police force that was still operating on mid-century intuition. The more they dug, the more the case slipped through their fingers. The Black Dahlia was becoming less a victim and more a symbol. A canvas upon which the public projected their own terrors about the dark heart of Los Angeles. And the police were left behind by their own investigation, a situation that would eventually lead them to a dead end. Who killed Elizabeth Short? The Los Angeles Police Department investigated hundreds of individuals in the immediate aftermath of the crime, but the list of suspects has only grown longer in the years since, fed by decades of armchair detectives, conspiracy theorists, and authors seeking the ultimate solution. The man who was closest to the case in the beginning, Robert Red Manley, a 25-year-old married salesman who had spent time with Elizabeth Short in the days leading up to her death. He was the last person to confirm seeing her alive, having dropped her off at the Biltmore Hotel in downtown Los Angeles on the afternoon of January 9th, 1947. Manley was the prime suspect for a significant period. He was subjected to intense interrogations, lie detector tests, and surveillance. His alibi was scrutinized, and his life was turned inside out. Yet the evidence did not point to him. His relationship with Elizabeth was complicated and unconventional for the era. The police ultimately cleared him. He passed multiple polygraphs, and his story that she had arranged to meet someone else at the Biltmore held up. Manley was a tragic figure caught in the crosshairs, but he was not the killer. As the years turned into decades, the vacuum left by the police failure was filled by a parade of theories. The medical professional theory, born from the autopsy, led by the FBI and the LAPD to investigate USC medical students and doctors, but this yielded no concrete results. Then there are the eccentric suspects, the names that frequently dominate documentaries and researches, considering Dr. George Hodel, a prominent Los Angeles physician with a dark past. Decades after the murder, Hodel's own son, Steve Hodel, a former LAPD detective, accused his father of the crime. Steve presented circumstantial evidence suggesting Dr. Hodel possessed the medical skill to perform the bisection and had ties to the surrealist art scene. which he claimed influenced the macabre staging of the body. While the theory is compelling and has gained significant traction, it remains just that, a theory. It is speculated that this man was involved in performing clandestine abortions and maintained corrupt ties with the LAPD. This accusation was built on decades of retrospective interpretation rather than hard, contemporaneous evidence. Elizabeth Short's father, Cleo Short, was not considered an official suspect by the police in the Black Dahlia murder case, but the man was a shameless individual who faked his death to get away from his family, committing the crime of fraud so he could be considered suspicious, being also in the same city when the body was found. There is also Leslie Dillon, a bellhop and former mortuary worker who possessed an unsettling knowledge of the crime specifics, details that hadn't all been released to the public. He was investigated by Sergeant Phineas Brown, who became convinced Dillon was the man. However, the LAPD internal investigation eventually soured on Brown, suggesting he was corrupting the investigation. Dillon was ultimately released, and the trail went cold again. There are countless others: the man in the brown suit, seen with Short, the various transients, the drifters, and even the lipstick killer. Each theory has its proponents, and each one has a plausible sounding narrative, but plausibility is not proof. The reality of the Black Dahlia case is that it is not a locked room mystery where the clues are all present and simply need to be assembled. It is a crime without a proven killer. The list of suspects is a testament to the public's desperate need for closure, but it also highlights the terrifying truth that sometimes the most horrific crimes are the ones that remain eternally unsolved. There have been countless murders in the decades since 1947, many of them solved, many more forgotten. Yet the death of Elizabeth Short has attained a permanent, ghostly status in American culture. It has become the foundational myth of modern true crime. The legacy of the Black Dahlia is complex. In one sense, it represents the absolute failure of justice. It stands as a chilling reminder that despite all the resources of law enforcement and the relentless gaze of the public eye, there are shadows in the world that simply refuse to be illuminated. The case exists in a space between history and folklore, a tapestry woven from the threads of genuine tragedy, media manipulation, and the persistent human need to find order in chaos. For many, the mystery is a reflection. We look at the photos of Elizabeth Short, a young, hopeful woman in an era defined by grand, sweeping transitions, and we see the fragility of life. We are drawn to the narrative because it is a story of promise interrupted. We want to solve it, not just to punish a killer who has likely been dead for decades, but to restore a sense of equilibrium. We want to believe that the universe is not a place where such senseless acts can occur without answer or accountability. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of the legacy is the realization that the Black Dahlia was a construction, an exaggeration of narrative spin that ultimately obscured the woman herself. She became a product of the press, an icon of the macabre, and a permanent fixture in the catalog of Hollywood scandals. Her true story, the life of a person who moved, who felt, who struggled, and who dreamt, was subsumed Last seen according to Manley's statement to investigators, wearing a black collarless suit, a fluffy white blouse, white gloves, nylon stockings, high-heeled suede shoes, and a full-length beige coat. The Black Dahlia murder remains a thin line between the mundane and the monstrous. The files remain open, and their shadows continue to loom. Some bizarre, cryptozoological, urban legends and fringe theories that parallel the folklore of the Black Dahlia murder, imagined around mystical and mysterious historical lore, are the phantom or apparition of Lemert Park because of the rareness of the situation. Other crazy tales suggest that it was the work of the chupacabra due to the lack of blood. The creature fed on her, a satanic cult on the high hierarchies of that society, like a ritualistic ofrenda. And finally, aliens that abducted Elizabeth and performed biological experiments to study human beings, remarking her abnormal body cuts. In closing, we are left with the silence of the archives. We have the files, we have the theories, and we have the enduring, grim fascination, but the truth remains elusive, hidden in the smog of Los Angeles.
You can't do anything more to me than what the Japanese have already done.
The Kremlin's over here, Phelps. Toss it, see what you find.
Don't think this is anything. Ackerman doesn't look like much of a dancer. Looks familiar. Safe bet it'll match the mark under Teresa Terreldson's chin. Ackerman, you were in the Marines.
How do you know?
The Corps selected big guys for flamethrower duty. That's how you got the burns.
Life expectancy was 5 minutes for a guy in flamethrower detail. What kind of a government puts weight like that on a man's shoulders?
You'll get no argument from me. It was a heavy load.
You feeling sorry for this smelly fuck?
Why did you kill Mrs. Terreldson?
I have no recollection of the people I have killed.
You hate women, Ackerman?
More than you could ever imagine.
How much did you hate Mrs. Terreldson?
I ache to put my seed in them. Afterwards, I have no use for them.
A bus driver dropped Mrs. Terreldson near your camp around 2 a.m. Why did you take her up to the hill?
Which hill? I have many places. I go where I please.
You are clearly insane, Ackerman. The state of California does not execute mental patients.
I don't know the names of the women I've killed, but I've killed many of them. Their necks are so fragile.
Where were you around 2 a.m. last night?
At the camp.
You were up on the hill. You were seen during the day. We have a witness. We have evidence. Come clean with me, Ackerman, and I'll see what I can do for you.
I despise your pity. You have nothing that links me to this woman.
We have you cold, Ackerman. Her purse and the ballroom ticket were in your lean-to. Tell us why you did it.
I kill because people need killing. It's what I was trained to do.
Stuart Ackerman, I am charging you with the murder of Teresa Terrellson.
A man down on his luck I can abide. But a filthy red who chooses to live outside the rules of society, I cannot stomach. Maybe poor Teresa Tarleton will provide the catalyst we need. I've spoken to the chief and the mayor, and I think it's time we send some men in to remove the godless and send them on their way over the county line. A grand day that will be, gentlemen. And a grand result you have brought me. You two are fast becoming my finest crusaders.